You're listening to episode 7 of the Emerging Leader podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode, and apologies, it's taken some time to actually get it edited and good to go and ready. But today is super exciting because I have my first ever guest on the show with many more to come. And my guest today is Dianne Glavaš, and she is a personal brand specialist specifically for young professionals and emerging leaders like ourselves. And we talk all about personal brand, such as what is it, how to determine what your personal brand is, how do you actually remain authentic in your brand, because I know that often we're concerned about authenticity and self-promotion, whether or not we actually need social media to have a personal brand, which is something that I've really struggled with as well. Like, do I need to be posting on LinkedIn? Do I need to be posting on Instagram? Do I need a podcast like everyone has? What do I need? She shares a lot about these simple changes that can make a huge difference in your personal brand as well. So it doesn't have to be this complete overhaul of who you are and becoming this kind of actor in your own life. Although she does talk about using an alter ego, which ties very closely to the identity episode that we talked about a few weeks ago, and using this alter ego to actually push yourself out of your comfort zone, which is a really, really incredible conversation. And we know that growth happens on the fringes of what we're trying to do, not in the middle of it. She talks about key aspects of your personal brand. So what is actually a personal brand? What are the key aspects of that, and small things that you can change within each of those? Common mistakes that people make with personal branding, both what she's seen with all of her clients and my kind of 2 cents on that. Determining your personal brand value proposition. So what is your VP for yourself? And that's a really interesting conversation as well, because everything has a VP, including ourselves. Why being an introvert is actually a superpower for personal branding, which this one completely caught me off guard, because as much as it doesn't seem like it, I'm actually an introvert myself. And that was a really powerful conversation about why is that actually a benefit for you to be introverted. And finally, about the importance of creating a vision. Everything has to start from a vision, including your personal brand, and we dive into that. So we absolutely cover so much in this episode. It's just over an hour long, and I really hope that you enjoy. We'll link all of Dianne's details in the show notes and the video and everything there. And she's truly amazing, and really grateful to have Dianne on as the first guest on the podcast. So with that, I hope you enjoy, and stay tuned for the episode. The Emerging Leader Podcast. So thank you, Dianne, so much for joining me on the Emerging Leader Podcast this week. I know personal brand is something that I've thought a lot about, and I know a lot of people either think a lot about it or probably don't think much about it at all. So really excited to have you on the episode and hear a bit more about personal brands and how young professionals can actually leverage that for their careers and in their own lives. But first of all, I'd love to hear about how you got into personal brand and your background, and, what excites you about personal branding for young professionals.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for having me, Ashley, on the podcast. It's such a pleasure to be here and to connect with emerging leaders that I know are a part of your community. And I'm really excited to share whatever I can to hopefully help in that space of personal branding. But my background is I started working in marketing probably about 15 years ago now. And in that time, I've worked in education, sport, retail, entertainment, usually a lot of, community focused, very people orientated businesses. And a few years ago, I'd sort of reached a bit of a crossroads in my work life and in my career, where I really had the opportunity to reassess, I guess, where it was that I wanted to take the next steps of my own career. And I guess to add to that on a personal note, I had 2 people very close to me pass away. That was my grandma and my dad in a very short period of time. as well. And it really just made me reassess, I guess, what I want to be doing going forward. Because when you have an experience like that, it really does make you think about the legacy that you're leaving and, how fulfilling things are for you. And so, yeah, I got into personal branding because for me, it just made the most sense when I really did some self reflection about the things that I'm number one skilled at and the things that I'm most interested in. So it was a way for me to pair up the background that I had long had in marketing and communications. I'd had that opportunity to, I guess, represent personal brand in those corporate brands throughout my entire career, particularly at that executive level or for the names that are sort of out there more in the public sphere. But I wanted to be able to do that for a whole range of people, to give people those secrets of marketing and communications at any level of their career. And I had found through my own career, I was really interested in always helping people in their development. I took I guess not unhealthy, because I would like to think all managers are like this, but I know I was just really, really interested in where people wanted to go in their career. So that aspect of working with emerging leaders was something that just felt like a really natural fit to me. So I work with emerging leaders, executives, and entrepreneurs, as well as part of my work as a personal brand coach and consultant and speaker.
Yeah, that's really amazing, and I can definitely empathize with those really tough moments in life where things happen, like, significant loss, which I'm so sorry to hear about. But I guess to be able to channel some of that into really questioning, like, what makes you happy and fulfilled. And
Mhm.
it's unfortunate that sometimes it has to take those really tough times for us to think about that. But it sounds like you've really channeled a lot of that into an amazing career and business for yourself now. When you say that you're doing a lot of speaking and presenting, what sort of audiences and groups are you sharing this with?
Yeah, so it's predominantly coaching and consulting, but I do the speaking thing I never actually intended to get into. That was one of those responding to demand as opposed to me planning to, but I do it because it truly pushes my comfort zone and it's something that I just want to keep doing. But the type of audiences that I deal with in that sort of space is usually emerging leaders, actually. So sometimes it will be things with universities, for example, or it will be organizations, nationally as well, if they want to connect with the emerging leaders in their organization and do some development work with them. It might be something that we can do online. And a lot of the times, emerging leader can mean different things to different people and in a different context. So when I speak to universities, for example, this might be in the undergraduate setting where they are about to enter their careers, or it might even be, for example, in the MBA program. I've had the opportunity to connect with some of the leaders in there as a part of that program too. So they're people that are emerging leaders in a very different context. They're looking to enter that next stage of their career. So yeah, I usually find it's quite a broad term that can apply differently.
Yeah, so I guess for the audience listening, I guess there's hope as well at any point in a career
Mm.
journey to kind of reinvent personal brand. And I guess maybe even to start this off, like, what is a personal brand? Why should people care about it? Um, yeah, what is it? Because I think people hear about brands obviously in the marketing sense, but yeah, what does that actually mean when it applies to us?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of definitions, and there's no sort of right or wrong with whatever a personal brand is. Everyone's kind of got their own. But one that I heard that I always use that has resonated with me is that your personal brand is what people think about you, how you make them feel, what they say about you, especially when you're not in the room, and how they remember you. And so when you really stop to think about what all of these things are, you'll probably realize that you don't actually get to control necessarily any of those things because they exist in other people's minds. Whether or not you choose to work on it, they exist. You have a personal brand. Even if you're a child, I like to say, children that you encounter, they have a personal brand. They leave an impression on you. And that doesn't change no matter what you're doing, whether you're working, whether you're not, whatever role you have, it still applies. But that's where I like to then talk about the power of personal branding, is that you can take control of potentially what your personal brand is. So you can control, I guess, the controllables in as much a way as possible to then go, okay, well, if people are already going to have an interpretation about how they see me and how they remember me, how do I help to ensure that it is actually aligned with how I want to be seen and remembered? So that's where I like to sort of distinguish between a personal brand and personal branding. For me, the branding is the work that you do or not.
I think that's just such an important point, and I guess helps people, including myself, not have our head kind of buried in the sand about it, because it's like if the brand exists regardless of whether you're investing in it or not, you might as well work on the branding side and
Mm-hmm.
try and influence, like you said, the points that you can control. Which is, yeah, that's real. I just love that point about how it exists regardless. So
Yeah.
we might as well do something about it. So in that case, because I'm sure that myself included and all of us kind of have ideas of what people might be thinking about us or what our personal brand might be, but how do people actually find out what their personal brand is? Outside of what they're perceiving, because I guess sometimes that wouldn't align with what our brand actually is.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you can be really spot on. Sometimes you can be pretty far off what your personal brand might be. But I did actually recently a piece of content just about on my podcast and YouTube, just about the 21 questions that you can ask yourself to reveal the personal brand that you already have. And if I try and remember just what some of those were, they were things like, and this is what I do with my own clients, is just really reflecting on, you can actively actually seek this out as well, but reflect on the feedback that you have received. But I like to do that in sometimes a more creative way than what you might always think. So the obvious ones are going to be things like, what has your boss said about you? What have maybe your former bosses and colleagues also said? What I like to distinguish between as well is that sometimes those former jobs are really important too, because you are, I guess when you leave an organization, you're often given feedback at that point. People love to tell you what it was that you did really well and what they'll miss, and all of that gratitude sort of comes nicely packaged in a farewell, and you get cards and all of these things. So I like to get people to reflect on maybe what those words were and what people said, maybe what they've had in reviews and different things as well, but also what their current workplaces may be saying about them, what their friends and family say about them too. So it's just starting to pay attention, really, just being almost relentlessly aware of the language that people use to describe you without being self indulgent. It's more just recognizing, okay, people are associating me with this particular thing, because that is what your personal brand is. It's the associations that you have in other people's minds. So if someone tells you, you're always this or you're always that, and sometimes it might be negative things as well, like you're always doing this, and you might not agree, but sometimes it doesn't matter because that's the association that they have. I also like to say birthdays is an interesting one, because I think birthdays, you often get, text messages and cards and, people say things. And again, it's just an occasion where that gratitude can come out. So yeah, they're just some of the examples that I think are a good way to sort of see what your brand already is. And if you want to be more proactive about it, you can actually reach out to people and go, hey, I'm actually trying to work on a few things. Would you mind describing me in 3 words or 5 words? And you can kind of work with that, or sit down with someone and ask them, what their perceptions are of you and what you might be able to work on.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting too, especially collecting feedback from previous workplaces and even current, and sometimes, like you said, going outright to ask these things. I know personally in our place of work, we recently did like a 360 review, which I think was eye
Mm.
opening for a lot of people, myself included. Some really good comments in that.
Mhm.
But yeah, like being able to ask the questions as well. What do you think too about people reflecting on their current situation? Like, for example, if they're looking to get more involved in other streams of work or other projects or with different people, how do you think that personal brand can relate to that? Or some of, I guess, the questions you can ask yourself about that sort of thing. Do you see a connection between personal brand and that sort of day-to-day application?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we can dive more into that if you are interested. Rebranding is a question that I get asked a lot. And I know sometimes it applies to people that are, a little bit further along in their career, but sometimes it is people quite early on as well. But in terms of going back to what you're talking about with potentially, wanting to work in another team or maybe different responsibilities within the organization, is yeah, I definitely do see a real alignment there with personal brand, because you're known maybe in a particular role to have a particular skill set. And I guess your job is to try and show what the transferable skills maybe are in that. For example, I had to, in my career now, show how my marketing communication skills, which was a very specific thing, could be transferred into doing that for people. And a lot of that wasn't about just going, well, I'm completely starting from scratch, because usually that's actually never the case. You're interested in a particular thing for a reason. Maybe you have a hobby or an interest in that area outside of work. Maybe it is that that particular thing is a niche within what you already do. So that was the case for me. It was a niche of marketing overall. I just honed in on that particular thing. But I guess what you have to remember is that people are associating you to that current job and that current role and your current skill set that you use most. So if you want to actively be involved in, say, other responsibilities, you have to, number one, be proactive about showing them how you can actually do that, or actually making your intentions clear to them that you are interested in that space. But also understanding that when it comes to your personal brand, nobody cares about your personal brand as much as you do. They probably don't care about it much at all. So you have to always, in personal branding, this is why I often think there's this misconception that it's all about self-promotion and being really self-indulgent, when really it is always about having this relentless focus of putting yourself into the mind of the other person and asking yourself how you can actually be of value to them. So if you have another team, for example, or another role, responsibilities that you are interested in, then put yourself in the mindset of that team or that person, that manager, whoever it is, and ask yourself, how can I prove to them that I have those skills? And that might involve having to do things like, unpaid opportunities and, maybe in your spare time. For example, if I was someone who was interested in marketing and, social media, and I wasn't a part of that team, I would spend my spare time developing those skills, maybe building a portfolio of something outside of work that you can go, okay, there is transferable skills there. And this person is actually, potentially as experienced as even my own team members eventually. I've hired people as well in the past, in my previous jobs, who weren't the most experienced on paper because maybe they were freshly graduated students, but because they had these side projects that they had done purely for fun, I knew they had all of the skills that we needed.
Yeah, I think that's really amazing. And you've almost perfectly summarized up the entire podcast so far about investing in these transferable skills. And if you see these gaps, how can you spend your spare time to really, I guess, teach yourself? And like that being one of the most incredible skills is the ability to learn and to have the motivation to actually do that. So I think that's absolutely
Mm.
crucial. And I've definitely hired people like that as well, that
Mm-hmm.
it's more about the motivation that they're showing and how they've taught themselves versus the experience on paper as
Yeah.
well. I think you touched on a really important point that I was going to ask later on, but happy to chat about it now, which is how do we remain authentic with our brand? Because some people do feel like it's a bit of self promotion. And I'm sure we'll talk about social media and whether or not that's actually required for a personal brand. But what is the line between self promotion and authentic personal brand? And how do you advise people to, I guess, remain in alignment with that authentic brand?
Yeah, and I guess self promotion, like those words in particular, just have almost this bit of a stigma around it because it's It's nothing that anyone ever wants to be. Well, most people don't want to be self-promoting. So I try and sort of just avoid that in the personal branding sphere anyway, having that conversation. But I do know, without completely disregarding it, it does have value, because really self-promotion, outside of the stigma around it, is about asking yourself what the value is that you have to offer. So some people, actually, what I find the issue with most people that I work with is not that they are super self indulgent and just want to self promote themselves. It is actually that it's quite the opposite, that they lack all of that confidence to understand why they are of value to the marketplace. So, from the aspect of self promotion, it's really about just understanding your skill set, your value, your actual personality, all those aspects of you, both technical skills and your soft skills, that actually make you valuable to the marketplace. And then it is about how you can package that up to actually be of value to people for whatever it is that they might need that for, that you're also interested in. But what I also like to focus on, though, is that, and we'll get to it, I guess, in all of this conversation, but personal branding is so much more than that. That is just one little aspect, is how you package what you are doing for the marketplace. Personal branding is you as a person. It's all of your interactions with people, whether that is you in your private life or you in your professional life as well. So what I like to think is that you're never going to have a completely inauthentic personal brand. It's almost just impossible to pretend to be this person that you're not all day, every day. But what I personally like to talk about, and this is something I know my clients are really used to me saying, and it's in some of my content, is that sometimes I feel like authenticity, as related to personal branding, has become this buzzword. And it was actually, I don't know if you're aware, but it was actually the word of the year for Merriam-Webster last
Oh,
year, was authenticity, which seems
interesting.
to be why we're just hearing it absolutely everywhere as well. We're not just imagining it. But the issue that I find with that is, like I said, so many of the people that I work with actually just don't have the confidence. So their authentic self is to not put themselves out there. My authentic self is that I would prefer to not do speaking opportunities. I would prefer to not be on social media. That's my authentic self. And the issue that I find when we stick to just what our authentic self is, we don't access that other side of our potential. I actually recently just did an episode about the concept of an alter ego. And this is this idea that, a lot of athletes use, a lot of, performers use. You had Kobe Bryant used his Black Mamba alter ego. Beyonce uses Sasha Fierce. And it just allows you to go, okay, this is what I would normally do. But in this certain scenario, I need to step out of what that comfort zone is. And the way I like to think about it, I brought it back to the concept of almost the yin and yang. It's that you have these two sides potentially of your personality. There's a duality there. And it's just about accessing that other side of your potential. It's not about being authentic. It's just about tapping into that. Because if you're always trying to be authentic, then you're always just going to be where you always have.
Yeah, I really love that. And just the idea that, yeah, authentic for us can sometimes feel like that comfort zone as well,
Yeah.
and it's not putting yourself out there. I'm also a bit of like a closet introvert.
Mm-hmm.
Putting out the podcast and doing all of this was totally out of the comfort zone. But I love that concept of alter ego as well. And we've spoken on the podcast before about identity and
Mm-hmm.
really not trying to completely recreate yourself so that you're far away from that authentic self, but I guess pushing yourself further to the boundaries of
Yeah.
that comfort zone. Because, like you said too, it's if you're wanting to provide value to other people or needing to provide value in order to get closer to your goals or to just help people in general, it's often not going to happen at the core
Mm.
of your comfort zone. It's going to happen on the fringes
Yeah,
and when you're
absolutely.
pushing that. So I feel like the identity and alter ego pieces is yeah, helping us, I guess, be more comfortable with
Mm.
stepping towards the fringes of that in order to provide value and also obviously help ourselves progress as well.
Yeah. And I think authenticity will always be the thing that underpins that, is that if you are stepping outside those fringes of your comfort zone. That's still you. That's just you unlocking that potential that already exists. I'm never going to be a singer, for example. That is just not the authentic me. So you're always going to live within what you were meant to be doing. It's just about letting go of some of those limiting beliefs about what that might be.
Yeah, totally, totally. One of the quotes that I loved a number of years ago, and it was about, starting your own business or putting yourself out there on social media, was that people need your skills and people need who you are, but they just don't know who you are. So
Yeah.
it's like, okay, well, if I have value that I can deliver, but people just don't know who I am, then how can I kind of like step over that barrier through obviously social media or just networking or whatever that is, in
Mhm.
order to unleash that. So I think
Yeah.
that's really amazing. So we've kind of like danced around it, but in terms of like aspects of personal branding, and you mentioned it a bit about how it's, how you show up both in your career and personal life and private life. What are some of the other aspects of personal branding, and what are some of are there any like common mistakes that you see people making with personal branding that might be quite easy changes to make, or just some of the common mistakes you see?
Yeah, so some of the key aspects, again, this definition might be different for everyone depending who you talk to, but what I've sort of honed it down to are some key things. And those things include things like your story is always going to be an aspect. And that story can be what you decide to tell people. Obviously, you don't want to lie about what that is. It obviously needs to be a true story. But I think where people can potentially sometimes, I think, go wrong, just to touch on your mistakes as well, is that they think that their story needs to be everything. It doesn't need to be your life story, it's your personal brand story. And it doesn't require you to overshare everything or to go, well, this happened to me when I was a child, and, I don't want to necessarily share it. You don't have to. It's totally up to you what you decide to share. What you are doing with your story is to share the things that are most relevant to your audience and most relevant to where you want to be positioned. Again, it comes back to your story. Elements of it might be interesting to you, but if it's not to the reason that your audience might connect to it, then you don't need to include that. Another aspect is your key messages. So once you understand, that vision and those values that you have for your brand, what are your key messages? The things that to some degree you can repeat in various ways over and over again so that people understand the values that underpin your personal brand. It is things like your tone of voice, and that includes your tone of voice, thinking about that as a brand would. For example, I like to say, Coca-Cola has a particular brand personality. It has energy, it has fun, it's got that friendly personality about it. But if you compare that to someone like, say, Tiffany and Co., that has elegance and sophistication. So it's using those concepts of branding and applying that to you as a person. And then when you're doing tone of voice work as well, you have to decide, as a brand would, is what is a tone of voice for that brand, but also what is it not? So when you are not being on brand, for example, if Tiffany and Co. started to speak in slang and, was really informal, it just would not suit that brand. But you can apply that to your own personal brand. So if you want to be known as being calm and composed, for example, then what that doesn't look like, a potential mistake that is hurting your personal brand, could be when you potentially lose your cool, or when you are rude, or when have a disagreement with someone and it's not in the most civilized way. So they're all things that are fine to do if you decide that's your authentic self that you want to live, but recognize that that is you being off brand for what you want to represent, potentially. I'd assume, hopefully, that is off brand. And then you can also look at things like your visual identity. That is really important as well. Think like a brand when it comes to that. So things like the colors that you are associated with, the colors that you wear. I talk about this so much in my content, that colors communicate for you. They have meaning, whether or not you choose to think about them. And just your identity in general. How do you show up, like, visually online or in anything that you are doing? That adds to your visual identity. And your clothing style as well, just how that personality comes through too. And, then you also have what else in that? So you've got your messages, your story, your visual identity, your tone of voice. That's probably the main things. There'll be other things in there, and that is all underpinned by, well, I like to say that's underpinned by your values and your vision. So all of that is almost the packaging element of it, that how you're positioning what you want to represent. Because we don't often go around going, okay, I've come up with what my 5 core values are. We don't just tell people what they are. We have to
Yeah.
embody them and represent that. So that's why we dress a certain way. That's why we speak a certain way, and we put out there the things that we do, because we are trying to express our values like any brand is, rather than just assuming they speak for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And like you said, I think even we would notice these things about other people that we see in the street, or even if we don't know them, like certain aspects that you've mentioned, we'll notice that about people's brand and start kind of forming a bit of a brand picture in our mind, even if we don't know these people.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
then, in terms of, and the way I'm thinking about it in my mind, and let me know if this isn't the case, is there would kind of be a few different phases of brands. Like earlier, you mentioned rebranding, of course, so potentially, which could happen, I'm sure, at any point. But then there would also be graduates coming into the career market, job market for the first time. And they might have a brand from earlier in their life, but might be looking to create something fresh as they start their career. So, what sort of phases do you see in this? And what would you recommend for people at each of those phases, whether it's creating a brand from scratch or, scratch in a new kind of period in their life, as well as rebranding? And what are things that people could actually do or start right away without doing a complete wardrobe overhaul, or I don't know, some of the small things that people could do at each of those stages to really make quite a big impact on their brand?
Yeah, absolutely. And a big one, actually, that I should have mentioned in the last question was the number one thing, actually, when it comes to your brand is probably your value proposition. So, what is it that you have to offer that is unique in the marketplace? And that can include your personal value and your technical value. So, I like to think of your technical value is all of the things that potentially other people might also have. So things like your qualifications, those skill sets, and your personal value is unique to you. So it might be a particular relationship that you have, a group that you've built in the community, just something that is more attributed to you, or your personal soft skills is an aspect of that as well. So whatever stage that you are at in your career, that is something to constantly be asking yourself, is what is the value that I have to offer the marketplace for that particular target role, whether you are just starting out in those early stages or you are looking to pivot your career, as you mentioned, that some people do later on as well. And I think a lot of the time when people are either rebranding later in their career or trying to shift maybe what that earlier, maybe they worked in retail and hospitality and, those jobs you often have when you're in university, and they're trying to pivot that into their professional life, is just focus on what the transferable part of that is. So what's the value proposition? Again, what's the personal part? So maybe you do have that side project that is really interesting to someone else in that stage of your career that you want to be in potentially. But what I also find is that when people are talking about rebranding, or they're thinking about rebranding, is that they assume that it is going to be this complete 180 change from what they've always done. But I like to think that and I use this word a lot, if you just think of it as being a pivot instead of a complete 180, it means that you can take all of those relevant things into that next experience. So try and not completely discount anything that you have done as being irrelevant, and instead go, how could this potentially apply? So you're wanting to connect that narrative of what you've already done into why it is relevant today. So pick the parts that are most relevant, and that applies at any stage of your career as well. So how could you just make that value proposition really clear. And a lot of that is having to do that deep work to go, okay, I think about my role potentially being a certain thing. You can probably, for a lot of them, just do your job on autopilot. You don't sit there and actually think about, all the aspects of that particular role. For me, for example, writing was always a big part of my role, and I couldn't say I necessarily loved it at the time, and now it is what I am most obsessed with. So but that took me doing that deep work to recognize what aspects of my previous role I wanted to take with me into that next chapter. But for people that are looking for a, quick win, is I like to sometimes say that with personal branding, it's always going to be a long game. It is how you are leaving an impression in the long term. So I do kind of avoid sometimes giving this illusion of quick wins. But when I think about it, I've got something coming out actually. I think next week, about just how you can instantly elevate your LinkedIn profile, for example. So, what I think the quick wins potentially are is very much sometimes in that visual identity space. I think it is really easy to have some quick wins in that space. You don't have to do a complete wardrobe overhaul or anything like that. But if you just pay attention to some of those things, you can very quickly almost show up as a more polished version of yourself if that's what you're going for the next week at work. That is a really quick change. Sometimes I think the rest of it, like tone of voice, that takes a long time to develop. It takes a long time sometimes to develop new technical skills or new people skills. But things like your visual identity is you can elevate your LinkedIn profile in a matter of minutes. There's just certain things you can do to take a better headshot, to have a more relevant, engaging cover banner, to have a profile that is more interesting and engaging to navigate, that showcases your value. But yeah, I just think wardrobe and your online profiles, those things are just really easy, quick wins.
Yeah, I think that's so important too for people to know that if they're not seeing immediate change with everyone around them, to keep going and to keep pursuing it because it is a long game. And, personal brand isn't something that is built overnight. Like even when we're getting someone else's personal brand or kind of building a mental model of who they are for us, it's often built up over sometimes years of working with people. So yeah,
Mm,
it's definitely going to be a long game,
yeah,
and I think just consistency is probably a really
yeah.
important aspect here, and just making those subtle changes and seeing, I guess, if there's feedback in the people around you or the type of work that you're doing, or yeah, I guess just how people are reacting to
Mm.
you.
I actually have an interesting example that actually comes to mind of someone that I worked with, and this might apply to people that potentially want to be promoted internally. And I remember they had been given, I think it was an acting role to begin with, and they've really stepped into that role in particular. And I had noticed that they started to really elevate their wardrobe, for example, really into more of that manager style of dressing. And I had made that comment to them, and they had said, "Do you know what, Diane? I'm actually doing that on purpose because I read that people are going to perceive me as still being associated to my previous role, and I really want to be associated in leadership's mind to this next level." So she was actively trying to even physically step into that role and be perceived not as that brand that she had always been, but to make that change. And it wasn't this huge dramatic change, it was just subtle enough for me to notice and to ask her. And it was exactly what she was doing.
Yeah, and like that's just so amazing too. And I've spoken about it before, and you talked about it earlier about hiring someone that had demonstrated these skills, or had, I guess, taught themselves some of these new skills. Because I think sometimes people, in the example of promotions, expect that they'll get promoted and then they'll start acting in
Yeah.
that way in the new promotion. When in fact, I think it's quite backwards. And it's not to say that you need to, if you're going for a manager role, just start managing people that you actually don't
Mm.
manage. But those subtle things, like you said about, communication, or some leadership things, or just the way that you're taking initiative on different items, and how you look personally, that can definitely, I guess, speed up that process. Because as a manager myself, I don't often hire people that don't demonstrate any of those qualities. They have to be
Mm.
actively demonstrating the qualities of the role that I would be promoting them into for me to
Mhm.
even really consider it. So I think that's such a relevant example for so many
Mhm.
people.
Yeah, it's definitely a quick win.
Yeah, definitely. So you touched a bit on LinkedIn and social media, and I know that everyone at the moment is all over social media, even if they're just kind of passively looking at social media. What role does that play in personal branding? Because I know a lot of people will be quite introverted and wondering, okay, do I have to put myself out there on LinkedIn? Do I have to become a bit of like an influencer in the space? What do you see in terms of social media and personal brand trends? What level is kind of the bare minimum if there is one? And what would you recommend for people in that space?
Yeah, I definitely, this is something I work on with all of my clients. I think you can't live in a world at this point where you just ignore the importance of social media. What I like to do is give it the appropriate amount of attention in personal branding. So, as we've talked about, your personal brand is something that exists in your face to face brand, interactions with everyone. And going back to your question about mistakes, that's probably the one mistake I find is that people think it is just your social media or your digital presence when it is actually every interaction that they have with you. So that's a mistake, is when people don't see it that way. But in terms of social media, I think, there's never going to be a rule that says people have to be on social media. I just think that in today's world, and this took me years only as of recently, the last few years, even working in marketing and leading social media teams to do this under my own personal brand, is we live in a world where there is just so much opportunity out there. And it's almost, to me, like deciding whether or not you want to use the internet. It just gets to a certain point where you're almost doing yourself a disservice. For example, if you were to hire someone at this stage who maybe doesn't have a LinkedIn profile, it's almost so common now that you would find that slightly unusual, I would imagine, if they didn't, or you would wonder maybe why that was the case. You would just have a momentary, question in your mind, and all of that adds to your personal brand. So there's no requirement at all, but I think it does help. And the reason why I actually, for the first time in my life now, find social media much more interesting in my own like private context is because there is this trend, as I'm sure you've noticed, that only seems to be increasing, where it's more about people sharing their expertise. And I use that word sort of lightly because I know some people don't like to think that they have expertise, especially if they're early in their career. But it's sharing your expertise. You could be a fresh grad, but you're sharing maybe projects that you work on, reflections that you've had, what you learned from this particular experience or project. So subtly over time, then, when you are constantly putting yourself out there and it's related to a particular field or a particular skill set or interest or expertise, it goes back to something you said earlier as well. It's that we want to position ourselves in other people's minds as being associated with a particular thing. So that, yes, we want to build awareness for our own skill set, but the way that we do that is to constantly put ourselves out there to be associated with that thing. So while people might not necessarily need the solution that you have to offer right now, you want it to be that when they eventually do, that they go, oh, well, I know Ashley is associated with emerging leaders. I associate Ashley to those words. And so you just are constantly putting yourself out there, hoping that one day when someone does have that problem that they want to solve, is that you have been attached to that thing. And a lot of the clients that I get will tell me that they have been following my blogs or my articles on my LinkedIn for a long time before they've actually contacted me. So also don't assume, and these will be sometimes people I don't know at all, most of the time actually. So don't assume that because you think nothing is happening from it, that it's not having an impact, because you never know who is potentially watching it. To not to be, to freak people out, but you never know, in a good way, that your next potential employer or someone, your next potential industry contact actually does pay attention to the things that you put out online. I, for example, actually get, since I started posting more educational style content as opposed to just achievements and events that I was going to, I'll get next to no engagement on LinkedIn that I can actively see compared to when I'd post a nice picture and you get, 100 likes or something like that. And you feel like it's going nowhere, but then you know that people are reading your articles because you can see those stats. And then you go to an event and someone will tell you about the articles that they have read and they reference that back to you, or months later someone will contact you because they've seen you constantly sharing this thing online, but you didn't realize that they were actually paying attention.
Yeah, I think again, it just proves that that consistency is so important, and just really trying to show up in the personal brand that you want, or the identity, or that alter ego of putting yourself out there.
Mhm.
And I think it's so important what you shared too about it not having to be this expertise, because of course when we go on LinkedIn and we see the people with hundreds of thousands of followers, we're like, well, I don't have that expertise. But the fact is that, like you said, we all have so much that we can share of value. And whether it is just, like you said, the projects that you're working on, so then you're building a bit of a brand around your skill set and what types of things you're working on. But yeah, it can be like these small lessons. And
Mm.
even like a great exercise, like you mentioned before, is because we're working on autopilot so much, like actively doing a bit of an audit of like, what skills am I actively using? Like, what have I learned through this? Or what am I doing now that I didn't know 3 years ago? And kind of trying to speak to that person that you were 3 years ago, and what
Mm.
could you teach them? So I think definitely for me, that's been a huge hurdle as well. I'm younger than all of these people in the industry, so what can I share that they don't already know? But I've just more focused on, yeah, what can I share that the Ashley of 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, or 5 years ago would have wanted to
Yeah.
know. And so it makes it a bit more personal to me and less scary, like I'm trying to
Mhm.
compete with the expertise of the
Mhm.
industry.
And that's such an important point, and so much of that is what is a really important message when it comes to personal branding, is to speak to the person that's just a few years behind you. And what would you say to that person? So I think you've actually just nailed that, because yeah, a lot of the time we think we have to be, 20 years, 30 years into our career to be considered an expert. But no, you could just be an expert because I once heard someone say you just have to be 10% better, not better, but more knowledgeable, or have some knowledge that someone doesn't yet have, but they would really benefit from you having just experienced that, for example. And I do think with online as well, just a way to sort of summarize that importance is that for me, it becomes a body of work. So with my blog, my YouTube channel, my podcast, which anyone can do for next to no cost for a lot of them, or very low cost, is you create a body of work. So when I, for example, now get an inquiry, that person might not have been watching my videos or listening to my podcast or reading articles already. But when they do at that moment, then there is a body of work. So it's about being not discouraged when you think that maybe it doesn't mean anything to anyone, because eventually they'll land on that and realize that you are someone who, number one, puts in all of that extra effort, that you are committed to whatever your interest or your industry is in a way that's going to set you apart from other people. So I always just remind myself is that, and my clients as well, is that so much of the time, I imagine you've had this experience with your podcast as well. It's just be willing to do the things that other people aren't willing to do. So while podcasts and things like that are becoming more popular, there's also the vast majority of people who aren't willing to do that. They don't want to overcome those limiting beliefs. They don't want to put themselves out there. They don't want to maybe feel embarrassed, as most of us do when we start all of these things. They don't want to face that feeling of what are their friends and family and colleagues going to think about them. So if you can get past those things, then you are doing the things that other people are not willing to do. And in the end, that's going to help you stand out in whatever you are working at.
Totally. And just, yeah, being able to immediately set yourself apart by doing that. And I think you're spot on. And I used to feel this way too when I would see people like us, like doing a podcast, like, oh my God, I could never do that. Like they
Mm.
must be ultra confident and super successful and have this amazing career and all of this. When in reality, like we're scared, but we do it anyways, or we're
Yeah.
nervous and we do it anyways. And of course, like, it gets easier over time as you're consistent. But again, it ties back to that kind of vision that you have for yourself, and how do you want to stand out? How do you want to share things, and pushing yourself more to the fringes of the comfort zone and kind of testing that a
Yeah.
bit, which I think is just such a critical message for young professionals, emerging leaders, or even people that want to rebrand or kind of pivot their brand later in their careers. And you touched on it before too, about how, it's not this sunk cost of, I've done this for so long, so I have to continue doing that. Like, what are those transferable skills? And they're probably way more than we actually expect. And
Mm.
that ability to teach yourself and learn and invest in yourself too, will definitely pay dividends, I'd imagine,
Yeah.
in the next career path.
Yeah. And you just reminded me that I hadn't answered your question properly about the introvert question. And yes, this is something I get a lot. A lot of my clients are introverted. I get this question a lot from students and professionals at all levels. I'm actually extroverted. So I do understand it a lot because I deal with so many people in that space. But the example that I like to use is that and I'm sure this has been your experience as well, but I'll say that despite me being extroverted, I don't want to put myself out there online. This is something that I've chosen to do because I know it is something that's useful to my clients and the people that I work with. But when I really think about what that process looks like, as you would, I imagine, know as well, it's that I produce a podcast and a YouTube video and a blog, and I post actively on LinkedIn, all from my office here, where I sit by myself 99% of the time. There's things like this that I do, and I get to meet with people online, but I do all of that myself. So when you think about being an introvert isn't about being shy, I think sometimes it gets caught up in that definition. It's about where you get your energy from. So extroverts get it from other people, introverts get it from the time that they spend with themselves. So for me, actually, the things that I have done in terms of putting myself out there for my personal brand, outside of the speaking to, rooms of people and things like that, it's actually been almost an ideal thing for an introvert to be doing because you spend so much time working on your projects, writing scripts, actually producing things, writing things on LinkedIn, whatever it is. You can do that all by yourself. You can
Mhm.
interact with people online while you are sitting by yourself. You can engage with people. You can comment on their posts while you're at home enjoying your downtime. And you can do that all with what introverts, I actually did a topic on this, but I think introverts have these superpowers that can actually be so useful when it comes to personal branding because introverts are so good at analyzing, at doing the self-reflection, at actually, assessing the data and the numbers and things like that and going, okay, well, how can I use this to meet my goals? Introverts are also really good at goal setting and thinking more long term as well. So you can do all of these things while you build your personal brand. You can do that sitting at home.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and you make me feel better about being an introvert as well. Because yeah, definitely, I just am in the office, editing, scripting, like you
Yeah,
said. And I
pretty
remember
lonely.
too, when I first started doing it, I remember I would post something on LinkedIn, and I would schedule it, so I didn't actually have to be on LinkedIn to do it. And then I wouldn't actually go on LinkedIn for weeks. I would just keep scheduling posts outside of
Yeah.
LinkedIn because I was like, just so scared of what people were going to comment on this stuff, that I was like, I'm just not even going to look. I'm not going to like anyone's comments. I'm not going to do any of it, because I had this, massive thing in my head of, oh my God, people are going to think this is embarrassing, and, this is crazy, and she doesn't know what she's talking about. And then by the time I actually got back on LinkedIn, 4 or 5 weeks later, the comments were the complete opposite. It was
Yeah.
very, very
Amazing.
supportive and
Hmm.
great messages from people. So I think too, I don't know about extroverts, definitely as introverts, we tend to kind of blow things up in our head. It becomes
Yeah.
very catastrophic about the reaction that we're going to have from people. And it's very rarely the case.
Yeah, and I think so much of that because, even as an extrovert, I relate to that feeling so much is that, you worry sometimes. I'm less so now because I'm so used to it. But at the start, you go, oh, this is just so different. I would never post anything like this. Who am I? And I just think it's about, again, it goes back to that comfort zone. So for me, every single time, a comfort zone isn't necessarily about having to jump out of a plane. It's not about doing these dramatic, huge leaps of faith. It is about those little things that you can do to just push where your natural sort of comfort zone is now so that you create a new comfort zone. And if that just means that, I used to post on LinkedIn maybe 2 to 3 times a year at best. And now it's weekly, multiple times a week. And once you do it once, you do it a couple times, you realize that, by the 10th time you've done it, it's much less scary and you're not even thinking about what people will think about it. You're just more thinking, this is part of my process and my routine, and I'm committed to helping people in this space. I want to provide this value. I don't really care what some people have to think about it because they're just not the right people for my personal brand if they do care. It's like being a magnet that you're going to attract what is meant for you and you're going to repel the people that weren't. And I just always think you have to give credit to the people that are in the arena as opposed to the people
Totally.
that aren't.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Which, like you and I share a favorite book, which is The War of Art. Like he talks about that too. It's like better to be something about, better to be in the ring with the bull than in the stands. And I
Yeah.
think that's so key in this. And you're not always going to have a fun time in the ring, but at least you're there and you're not just
Mm.
passively watching as well.
Yeah, and I use this example a lot when it comes to LinkedIn or any social media in general, is that there's this generalization that 90% of people are lurkers on LinkedIn. This applies across a lot of platforms. And they like to say, for example, it might be 91% of people, sorry, the 9% of people are consumers. So they're not necessarily lurking, but they're the people that are liking and commenting and consuming everyone else's things. But then there is maybe that 1% or that 5%, however you want to break it down, whatever it is, it's the minority who are the ones who are actually creating, for example, on a platform. And to me, I go, well, you can decide if you want to be the type of person in an industry who is lurking. You can be a lurker. That is fine. Some people are more equipped to be a follower if that's what they want to be in their career. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you decide that you want to maybe do things differently and to be a leader in particular things, then it is that easy to control being in that minority group. All you have to do is create, for example, and put yourself out there, and you're automatically doing what the majority is not willing to do.
Exactly. And like you said, you might not see a payoff in that immediately, but down the track, you'll have these people that will remember the work that you've done or what you've posted or how you've put yourself out there or shared. And, that could absolutely open up different opportunities in career or clients if it's in your own business or just even people reaching out to ask questions and things. I think that's such a huge opportunity so that you're, maybe for your next job, if you have a personal brand, you're not having to apply for a bunch of stuff on Seek because you are actually being sought out by
Mm-hmm.
people in those roles. So I think it's a huge
100%.
opportunity for people.
Yeah. And just going back to even what you said about you just never know, as I said, you never know what people might see if they go back and, see what you have done online potentially. But also, I've had my very first paid speaking opportunity that I can remember was someone who was referring to a article that I had published. I think it was about 4 or 5 months earlier. But they had gone through Google to find me, number one. So it was a complete stranger at the time, gone through Google, found not just my blog, but had found a very specific topic that they had gone, yep, that is what we want someone to talk about. And that ticks the box. So even with the body of work, there might still be, if you just have this collection of things, you never know what that one thing is that is going to put people in a position where they go, I can actually connect with that person now. That actually
Yeah.
resonates with me and what I'm looking for or my values.
Yeah, that's like such a good message, because yeah, even if that article didn't have as many views as the other, you might be discouraged or wanting to kind of like write off certain topics. But you're exactly right. Like there are people that will come out of the woodwork and absolutely need what you have in your business. And I think that's honestly just so amazing.
Mhm.
Um, Honestly, we've covered so much about personal branding, and I love the points that you've made about how important it is and how it absolutely exists. And even just thinking about it through this conversation, I'm like, okay, what are some of the personal brands that I perceive of people that I work with in a day-to-day basis? So just thinking about it, and how we might as well invest in it if it is something that we have regardless, and some of those things that we can do continuously, and really looking at how do we take the skills that we have from our career and our lives and pivot those into one, obviously what makes us happier, but also just, yeah, the direction that we want to take. So I think we've
Mhm.
covered so many amazing things that the audience is absolutely going to love. And I know that you help so many emerging leaders and people pivoting and graduates as well. So it's just fantastic. And I mean, I also found you online just through searching for
Oh,
exactly
yes,
this. So
exactly.
there you go. It's like perfect
True. Good
perfect
example.
example of
Yeah.
that. So yeah, look, thank you so much for joining on the podcast. I know people will absolutely resonate with what you've shared. How can people get a hold of you or reach out or learn more about what you're doing in your business if they have any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I have LinkedIn, YouTube, and my podcast. And if they just search Dianne Glavash, then I think I'm well and truly the only one in that space. I've got a website, and that's home to sort of all of my information. But yeah, if they're just looking for more content like this or more of an in-depth discussion about all of these things, then that's the place that they can go. Can I just
Yeah.
add one more thing,
Of
actually? I just
course. Yeah,
thought
of
about
course.
this as you were wrapping up there as well,
No,
is
no.
that a lot of the time when we think about our personal brand, we often think about just the next few years ahead. And, you get asked that question a lot in interviews, where do you see yourself in the next 5 years? But one of the most important things, which I start my programs with, is to have an actually really clear vision for your personal brand. And
Mm.
by that, I mean, think like a business and imagine where you want your future to be in, say, 20 years from now, and reverse engineer that vision from there. So instead of just thinking this is the next job opportunity and yeah, that could be interesting, ask yourself if it actually potentially takes you one step closer and just a little pivot in that direction of where you want to be in the long term.
Yeah, I love that. And vision is just absolutely huge, and especially reverse engineering it versus, seeing where you are now and kind of moving a few steps forward, but doing it a bit backwards as well. And the last one of the most recent episodes, I talked about Jeff Bezos' regret minimization framework, where he projects himself to be 85 years old and basically looks
Yeah.
back on his life. And I
Yeah.
think that's just such a powerful way of picturing this. And like, yeah, what would you regret the least? And that might be putting yourself out there on LinkedIn, which could open up opportunities, or investing more in your brand, or starting a business, or pivoting in your career. I think
Mm.
vision is just absolutely critical.
Yeah. And if you're trying to work out what that is, because that's a very big question for people to ask, and I often tell people to picture that end of their life as well. But just start with, what does your ideal day look like? What does your ideal week look like? So, what would you be doing in terms of job tasks or skills that you would actually be utilizing? And how does that fit into your personal life as well? And what does that ideal life look like? And then you can create all of those things together.
I think I need to revisit that exercise as well, and we'll definitely take some inspiration from this. So it's honestly been an absolutely amazing conversation, and hope it continues. And I'll definitely be listening more to your podcast, and love the blog, so we'll be reading that as well. Um, yeah, and obviously we'll link all of your details in the bottom as well. But thank you so much again for joining on the episode, and really appreciate you and all of your wisdom that you shared today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ashley. I really appreciate it.
I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that are listening to the podcast.